I bought the ranch long before the HOA ever noticed it existed. It sat at the edge of what used to be open land, acres of scrub, fencing, and quiet that stretched farther than most people were willing to walk. The house wasn't flashy. The barns weren't new. But everything on that land was solid, paid for, and deliberately left alone. I didn't buy it to impress anyone. I bought it because it was mine and because distance was part of the value. For years, nothing bothered it. Then development crept closer. Roads were widened. Signs appeared. A community formed where there hadn't been one before. Eventually, that community organized itself into an HOA. At first, they ignored the ranch, treating it like a leftover detail from a past they couldn't quite erase yet. I paid taxes, maintained the property, and continued living exactly as I always had. The first letter arrived, without warning. It was framed as a notice, not a conversation. According to the HOA, several structures on my ranch were non-compliant with newly adopted community standards. They cited visual uniformity, safety concerns, and alignment with the neighborhood's future vision. I assumed it was a mistake. The ranch predated the HOA entirely. Their rules didn't apply to land they didn't govern. I replied calmly, explaining the timeline and attaching property records. The response came back sharper. They insisted that because the ranch now sat within the community boundary, it was subject to enforcement. They requested I submit demolition plans for multiple structures and warned that failure to comply could result in fines. That was irritating, but still manageable. What turned irritation into disbelief was the follow-up email sent the next morning. This one had a deadline: 24 hours. Tear down the ranch structures or face immediate corrective action. No appeal window. No meeting. No discussion. Just an order. I reread it several times, expecting to find a typo or a missing attachment. There was none. They were serious. Or, at least, they thought they were. The language was aggressive, confident, and completely detached from reality. They wrote as if they had unquestioned authority, as if ownership were conditional on their approval. I walked the property that afternoon, past the fences and barns they wanted gone. Nothing about it looked temporary or negotiable. Every post was set deep. Every building had stood longer than the HOA itself. The idea that a group of people who had arrived years later could demand its removal in a single day was almost surreal. Neighbors started calling. Some were confused. Others were sympathetic but cautious. A few admitted the HOA had been talking about the ranch for months, calling it an obstacle to development plans. Apparently, someone on the board believed pressure would solve the problem quickly. Force compliance before resistance could form. That assumption told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about safety or standards. It was about control and convenience. They wanted the land to change, and they wanted it fast. They believed a deadline would intimidate me into acting against my own interests. I didn't respond immediately. I let the clock run. I wanted them fully committed to their position, confident in their demand. Because once someone puts something like that in writing, they rarely realize how exposed it makes them. As the sun set over the ranch, the deadline ticking quietly in the background, I felt an unexpected calm. Not anger, not panic, just clarity. They thought they were dealing with someone who needed permission to exist there. They were wrong. And by the time they realized it, the leverage they assumed they had would be gone entirely. The next morning, before the deadline expired, another message arrived. This one wasn't addressed just to me. It was copied to several board members, a property manager, and a generic legal inbox. The tone was colder, more formal, and far more revealing. They stated that failure to comply within 24 hours would authorize the HOA to pursue remedies, including fines, access enforcement, and cost recovery for corrective action. They were threatening to come onto my land. That was the moment I stopped treating it as a misunderstanding. I pulled every document I had related to the ranch. Deeds, survey maps, county zoning records, historical use filings. The ranch wasn't just older than the HOA. It existed under an entirely different classification. Agricultural, mixed use, grandfathered long before the subdivision ever broke ground. The HOA boundary line stopped at my fence. They had no authority past it, no matter how many times they repeated the word community. What they did have, I noticed while reading through old paperwork, was a lease. Years earlier, before the development expanded, the HOA had negotiated access agreements for shared infrastructure, water routing, service roads, utility easements. Buried in those agreements was a small but critical detail. Several HOA-owned facilities sat on land that wasn't theirs. They paid rent for it. To me, the arrangement had been quiet, automatic, and intentionally boring. A long-term lease with renewal clauses that adjusted only if triggered. It hadn't needed attention because no one had given me a reason to look at it closely. Until now. I read the lease again, slowly this time. Termination rights. Adjustment provisions. Default conditions. There it was. A clause allowing rent reassessment if the tenant initiated hostile action, legal interference, or attempted enforcement beyond jurisdiction. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. And it gave me options. While the HOA counted down the hours on their demand, I prepared a response of my own. Not emotional. Not defensive. Just factual. I attached property records showing the ranch's exclusion from HOA authority. I included zoning confirmations from the county. And finally, I referenced the lease, specifically the clause they had just activated by putting their threat in writing. I sent it 30 minutes before their deadline expired. The effect was immediate. Within an hour, the property manager replied asking for clarification. Then another board member asked if we could pause enforcement while reviewing the information. A third email followed suggesting a meeting. The 24-hour ultimatum vanished the moment they realized the ground they were standing on wasn't theirs. But I didn't stop there. I issued formal notice of lease reassessment, citing their attempted overreach and documented threats. Under the terms they had signed, the rent adjusted tenfold. It wasn't punitive. It was contractual. The new amount went into effect immediately, payable within 30 days. Silence followed. Not the strategic silence of negotiation, but the stunned quiet of people recalculating power. The HOA had approached the ranch as a problem to eliminate. They hadn't remembered that parts of their own operation depended on it. Neighbors started calling again, this time with different questions. Some asked if the demolition order was real. Others whispered that the board was scrambling, holding emergency meetings, trying to understand how things had flipped so quickly. The same people who had been confident enough to give me 24 hours were now discovering that deadlines cut both ways. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the ranch remained exactly as it had been that morning. Still standing. Still mine. The difference wasn't visible from the road, but it was decisive. The HOA had made its move assuming authority it didn't have. And in doing so, they'd handed me leverage they couldn't ignore. By the end of the week, the HOA's confidence had fully collapsed into confusion. The demolition order was never mentioned again, not even indirectly. Instead, I received a series of carefully worded emails asking for time, clarification, and good faith discussion. The same board that had demanded action in 24 hours now wanted patience. That reversal alone confirmed how badly they'd misjudged the situation. Their biggest problem wasn't the rent increase itself. It was what it represented. The lease had always been an afterthought to them, a line item buried in budgets and automatically approved year after year. Now it was front and center, and suddenly 10 times more expensive. Facilities they depended on every day, access roads, utility placements, shared service corridors, were sitting on land they didn't control. And for the first time, they had reminded me why. An emergency board meeting was called. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. People talk when they're nervous. Neighbors relayed what they heard. Arguments about whether the ranch was truly outside HOA authority, questions about who approved the original threat, and panic over how to explain the rent spike to homeowners. Some board members wanted to backtrack quietly. Others wanted to fight, insisting that no single property owner should have that much leverage. That line made its way back to me, and it told me everything. They weren't upset because they were wrong. They were upset because they'd lost control of the narrative. For years, the HOA had operated on momentum, rules enforced because no one questioned them hard enough. The ranch disrupted that pattern simply by existing. I received a formal request for mediation. They framed it as collaboration, emphasizing shared interests and community harmony. I agreed to listen, but I didn't suspend the lease adjustment. The contract didn't require me to. And leverage only works if you don't give it away prematurely. When we finally sat down, the tone was entirely different from the emails that started it all. No demands. No deadlines. Just careful language and cautious smiles. They acknowledged that the ranch predated the HOA and conceded that enforcement may have extended beyond intended scope. Not an apology, but close enough to one to show they understood the risk. They asked what it would take to resolve the issue. That phrasing mattered. It wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about relief. I laid it out plainly. The demolition order was to be formally withdrawn in writing. Any record of noncompliance against my property removed. And future communications regarding the ranch would acknowledge its exclusion from HOA authority unless voluntarily agreed otherwise. In return, I was willing to discuss revisiting the lease rate after a review period. The room went quiet. Not hostile. Calculating. They knew the rent increase was legally sound. Fighting it would cost more than paying it, at least in the short term. And they knew that escalating further risked exposing the board's actions to homeowners who were already sensitive to rising dues. The ranch had become an inconvenient truth they couldn't bulldoze. A week later, the withdrawal notice arrived. Clean. Unambiguous. The 24-hour order was officially voided, described as an internal error. No justification. No spin. Just gone. The next message confirmed removal of all enforcement notes from their system. The lease adjustment remained. What surprised me wasn't their compliance. It was how quickly the rest of the community adapted once the board's authority was visibly checked. Conversations shifted. Questions were asked. The HOA stopped issuing ultimatums altogether, replacing them with recommendations and extended timelines. Power, once interrupted, rarely snaps back into place the same way. The ranch stood unchanged through all of it. Same fences, same buildings, same quiet, but the ground beneath the HOA had shifted. They had approached me as an obstacle to remove. Instead, they'd reminded themselves that authority only works when it's real, and that contracts, unlike threats, don't blink. By the time the dust settled, the ranch wasn't just untouched. It was untouchable. And the people who had tried to erase it in a day were now budgeting around its existence very carefully every single month. The rent increase rippled outward faster than I expected. Within a month, homeowners began asking questions the board couldn't easily answer. Dues notices went out higher than projected. Maintenance projects were quietly postponed. A few amenities that had been promised in glossy newsletters were suddenly under review. None of this was announced as being connected to the ranch, but people noticed patterns even when leadership tried to blur them. That was when the HOA shifted strategies again. I received a new proposal, this one dressed up as a long-term solution. They wanted to renegotiate the lease entirely. Longer term, fixed rate, mutual cooperation language. They framed it as stability for everyone involved, a way to reset relations and move forward constructively. The implication was clear. They wanted certainty back. Predictability. Control. I didn't dismiss it outright. I read every page. The proposal looked reasonable on the surface, but the subtext was familiar. In exchange for lowering the rent, they wanted concessions. Access assurances. Easement expansions. Language that blurred jurisdictional lines just enough to reopen the door they'd slammed into earlier. It was careful, lawyered, and still fundamentally about reclaiming leverage. I declined again. Not angrily. Not dramatically. I thanked them for the effort and told them the existing lease already provided stability. Any future adjustments would require demonstrated good faith over time, not urgency created by their own missteps. I reminded them, gently, that the current terms were being followed exactly as written. That ended the negotiations. What followed was quieter but more telling. The HOA stopped treating the ranch as a problem to be solved and started treating it as a fixed boundary. Board minutes reflected it indirectly. Language around community scope became more precise. Enforcement policies were revised. Deadlines lengthened. Legal review was added where it hadn't existed before. The ranch had become the example no one named, but everyone remembered. Neighbors' behavior shifted too. Some who had once avoided eye contact now waved. A few stopped by to talk, careful at first, then more open. They shared stories about past enforcement scares, sudden letters, unexplained fines. Things they'd accepted as normal because they didn't know alternatives existed. The ranch situation gave them context. Proof that the HOA's authority wasn't absolute. One afternoon, a former board member reached out privately. He admitted the 24-hour order had been a gamble pushed by a small group within leadership. They'd assumed speed would prevent resistance and that any fallout could be managed quietly. When it backfired, the rest of the board realized how exposed they were. Not just legally, but reputationally. That exposure mattered, more than money. HOAs survive on perception. The belief that they're orderly, necessary, and acting in residents' best interests. Once that image cracks, every decision becomes harder to justify. The ranch had done that without shouting, without lawsuits, without spectacle, just by refusing to comply with something that was never legitimate to begin with. The tenfold rent remained in place, paid on time every month. Not because the HOA liked it, but because challenging it would reopen questions they desperately wanted buried. Over time, it became part of their budget reality, a reminder baked into spreadsheets and forecasts. A line item that quietly said, "Know your limits." From my side, life returned to its usual rhythm. The ranch didn't change. The work continued. The land stayed productive and calm. What had changed was the space around it. The invisible pressure that once crept in from the development side was gone, replaced by a cautious distance. It struck me how quickly authority collapses once it's forced to confront facts instead of assumptions. The HOA hadn't lost power because I took it from them. They lost it because they tried to use power they never had. The rent increase wasn't revenge. It was correction. A rebalancing that made future overreach expensive enough to think twice about. By the time another year passed, the story had already started to fade into community lore. People remembered the headline version, not the details. That suited me fine. The outcome didn't need to be loud to be permanent. The ranch remained, unthreatened and unchanged, while the HOA learned to operate with a little more caution, a little more humility, and a clear understanding that some lines, once crossed, redraw the map forever. By the time the situation fully settled, the ranch had become something more than just land on a map. It had become a reference point. Not officially, not in writing, but in the way decisions were now made around it. The HOA didn't mention it, but they orbited it carefully like people who had learned the hard way where the edge was. The rent payments continued without incident. On time. In full. No notes attached. No commentary. Just quiet compliance. The same board that once believed it could erase decades of ownership with a 24-hour deadline now treated a single line in a lease as a movable law. The contrast was striking. Authority had shrunk back to its actual size, and everyone could feel it. Homeowners noticed the change too. Enforcement letters became rare and far more detailed. Deadlines stretched from days into weeks. Legal reviews appeared where none had existed before. The HOA didn't suddenly become benevolent, but it became careful, and that was a meaningful difference. Carefulness is what shows up after consequences. I never raised the rent again. I didn't need to. The tenfold increase did its job simply by existing. It wasn't about punishment. It was about permanence. Every monthly payment reinforced the same lesson. Power used incorrectly doesn't disappear, it relocates. In this case, it relocated back to where it belonged. The ranch itself never changed. Same routines. Same fences. Same early mornings and long evenings. The land didn't care about board votes or community visions. It responded only to work and time, the way it always had. That constancy became grounding after weeks of emails and tension. It reminded me why I'd bought it in the first place. Occasionally, someone new to the neighborhood would ask about the ranch, curious why it didn't look or operate like the rest of the development. Others would answer before I could. "It's different," they'd say. It's not under the HOA. The way they said it carried weight now. Not resentment. Respect. I thought back to that first email demanding demolition in 24 hours. How certain it had sounded. How final. It was a reminder of how often authority relies on tone more than truth. Say something loudly enough, confidently enough, and most people assume it's valid. Until someone checks. I didn't win because I was aggressive. I won because I was patient and precise. I didn't argue with opinions. I responded with documents. I didn't rush to defend myself. I let the other side overcommit, then showed them exactly what they'd triggered. The lease didn't escalate. It simply executed. That distinction mattered. Escalation invites conflict. Execution ends it. There was no dramatic apology, no public reckoning, no board member stepping down in disgrace. Real life rarely offers those endings. What it offers instead is adjustment. Behavior changes. Lines get redrawn. People remember. The HOA remembered. They remembered not to issue ultimatums outside their jurisdiction. They remembered to check boundaries before enforcing rules. They remembered that not every property inside their view was inside their control. And most importantly, they remembered that contracts are quieter than threats, but infinitely stronger. From time to time, I'd catch sight of a board member driving past the ranch road, slowing just a bit before continuing on. No wave, no glare, just acknowledgement. The kind that says, "We know." And that was enough. The ranch remained exactly where it was before all of this began. Standing, productive, unmoved. The difference was that now everyone else knew what it was too. Not an obstacle, not a problem, but a boundary that had been tested once and would not be tested again. In the end, the 24-hour deadline did what it was never meant to do. It didn't destroy the ranch. It exposed the HOA. And once that happened, the balance corrected itself permanently. Sometimes the most effective way to protect what you own isn't to defend it loudly, but to let the people who challenge it reveal how little ground they're actually standing on.